much, Dick. And I just want to let everybody know that this is wonderful, amazing that we have such a turnout today. And if you could just right now, if you could turn on your camera just for a second so that we can see everybody. And a couple things about today. The first one is we will have a discussion. So be ready to participate in that. And but what we're going to do is kind of set up the discussion through information. And the information is a combination of my presentation and then also we have some expert speakers with lived experience, and I'll talk about them in a minute. What I want to do now is sort of get a feeling for who's in the room. And one other point is I'm in transition. I am in cyberspace, but I'm also in a place that I might get evicted at any moment. So if that happens, we'll just move to another room and try to figure this out from there. But I would just offer to be flexible today. So and we will wrap up right at 1:30, if not a minute or two before, because I will lose this space at that time. So first of all, what I'd like you to be doing is to be thinking about, and I want you to drop this in the chat. I want to see what your thoughts are. Why is this issue important to you? Why did you make some time today to be with all of us? What is it that that drew you here? What is it about the 710 Freeway stub, or about social justice, about equity, about inclusion in our community? Why would you spend your lunchtime with me and Dick instead of maybe in Old Pasadena enjoying this beautiful day? So go ahead, on the count of three, start typing in the chat. It could be just a phrase, doesn't have to be a paragraph or anything, but why is the 710 Freeway stub important to you? Why did you come today? So 1, 2, 3, go. This is so cool. You know, we've lived this pandemic experience, but it's given us the ability to be able to connect and communicate in ways that we didn't before, or that we weren't utilizing as well. So this is really important for us to be creating a community here in this moment, so that we can learn a little bit more about each other and about what it is that motivates us. Okay, so let me go through a few of these. I want to learn more. Obviously, I want to learn more to support advocacy and equity in housing. So just be thinking about, the other thing I'm going to ask you to do is to be thinking about, if this were a perfect world and you were the designer for 40 acres of Pasadena's landscape, what would you put there? Why would you put it there? And who needs to be a part of that discussion? So that's going to be a little bit later on, after we're going to do some level setting so that we're all kind of on the same page about what we're talking about and why. But in your heart of hearts, what would you like to see there? Okay, some of the other ones, I enjoyed the recording on race, and I want to learn more about our history. My family lived in a home that was there when the freeway would be, and we were evicted. Great. We're gonna we want to hear some lived experience too, so that'll be really important to share. Want to learn more. I remember when urban renewal did the same thing in my hometown, destroying poor neighborhoods and displacing mostly people of color. This is a really key concept, and we'll dive into this just a little bit today. Obviously, this is not a college course where we're going to be spending 10 or 16 weeks together, but it's going to at least give you an introduction. So curiosity, racial justice, eminent domain, that's really important. Any forum I can participate about recognizing marginalized groups is good. Longtime resident, learning about the 710 Freeway stub, urban development. And then in this case, I want everybody to be thinking about a little bit different concept. This is kind of urban redevelopment, and we have some planners in the room, so they can, they're more astute than I am about the real language. But this is kind of redevelopment of a space that was a neighborhood. Then now it's whatever 5 million tons of concrete. And so how could it be redeveloped to be of benefit? So thank you all for those contributions. I would ask you as your next task to scroll through that list, read what other people have said, and then try to understand what they're coming from. And then also let's try to figure out how we can make this as productive as possible for everyone. So take a look at what other people have written and just see where you resonate with something else someone else said. So thank you for doing that. So let's kind of start. I'm going to do a little bit of a history or historical perspective, very brief, and then we'll talk about what was there before, and we'll talk about what is there now, and then we'll talk about what it could be in the future. So I'm going to share the screen for a minute, and then I'm going to be jumping back and forth in between screen sharing and then seeing everybody's great faces today. So let's start with share. And before I go there, we'll go here so I can see some people. All right, so again, thank you all for being here today. This is wonderful, and thanks to the Pasadena Village for offering this opportunity. We don't have, one thing I'd like to do to frame this is we don't always have the opportunity to talk about these issues in a community-led way. So this is not driven by government. This is not driven by academia. This is just neighbors getting together and talking about it. So thank you all for being here. I just want to talk about some agreements for dialogue. Since some people will be unmuting and will be sharing, and here are some ones to be thinking about. So enter the experience with an open mind. So it's engage in a positive way. Notice all that occurs. It's hard. The nonverbal is hard on Zoom, but you can see people's faces and you can see how they're responding. Give yourself permission to be authentic, be honest, be true, but then also be thinking about other people in the room and be respectful. Acknowledge that none of us is perfect. Get what you need. So let's try to make sure this is productive, and then enlighten others by sharing your experiences and thoughts. When I do this with classes, I usually ask if everybody is okay with this. And so maybe by a thumbs up, either physically or on the reactions. Is everyone okay with these? Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Juliana. Okay, I'll assume everybody else is. What I'd like you to do is put in the chat real quick. Is there anything else that we should be thinking about? What I do is I like to add, the one that's hard for me is brevity. As you can see, I'm talking too much, but so be brief and be respectful of others, because if we're going to have other people talk, it'll be important that we have that time to do it. So if you have anything else that you want to add to our agreements, throw it in the chat right now, and we will pay attention to those too. So this is so a lot of the presentation is going to be visuals as well. So I'm sure everybody is familiar with this. Anybody, and I'm sorry I can't quite see the chat for some reason. Does anybody know about what year this image was taken? I should have a chat monitor. Anybody want to be my chat monitor? Janine Bogart, you want to be my chat monitor? If you know approximately what year this is, then throw it in the chat. Carol, I saw your lips move. What year do you think it is?
1928.
No, because this is an aerial, so that would have been a Zeppelin that would have taken this.
Oh,
And then the bridge, if you look at the bridge down at the bottom, you see both the Colorado Street Bridge and you see the Freeway Bridge for the 134.
that's what I was curious if I was looking at both.
Yeah, so it's 1966. Whoever got that right, the Pasadena Village is going to give you a free lunch at the restaurant of your choice. So actually they're not, but you can ask them. So and you can put this in the chat too. What is the freeway on the right and what is the approximate year for that? And by the way, some people complain about traffic in LA right now. And as you can see from the vintage of those automobiles, there has been traffic here for quite a while. So it's not like it's a new phenomenon. So what are we going to cover in this discussion? How, and this goes to what some of the people said in the first chat round, is how were freeways used to historically divide neighborhoods and to historically divide communities of color from the rest of the city. What did the neighborhood look like before the construction of the 710 freeway? And this is specifically the 710 stub. And then how were family schools, businesses, churches, etc., impacted by the freeway? What is the current disposition of the area of the city? And what are governmental plans for its redevelopment? That will be kind of a surface level. It's not going to be real deep because it's kind of a moving subject. And then what this goes to the question I asked you before, is what might your role or our role be in the process of redeveloping that land? So this is what we want to talk about today. What I'd like to do is I generally, when I make these presentations or participate in these conversations, I like to invite people from the community to help because I'm not, I don't have lived experience with all of the subjects, and I also am not the complete and total expert on these topics. So today we'll have Jose Luis Correa, who's here with us, and I'm going to be asking him some questions. He actually lived in the neighborhood. So we want to hear a little bit about what the community was like when he was living there, and then what the impacts were on families. Tina Williams will be with us as well, and she and Dr. Gilbert Walton have some ideas on, they have a project that they're working on to help with the redevelopment. And then Danny Parker, who's a local historian and neighborhood leader, will be with us eventually, and he'll talk a little bit about some of the impacts. And then we were going to have Alma Stokes, who many of you know. She yesterday had an operation, and she's fine, but she's not going to be able to join us today. But I just wanted to mention her because she's been a vital part of this work for the last 2 years that Danny and I and Chip Williams have embarked upon. All right, so let's actually, I'm gonna take off the screen share for a second. Are there any, how does this sound to you as far as an agenda for today? Can I have a thumbs up again if this works for you? Thank you, Phil. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Wayne. Thanks, Sharon. Okay, great. And then when Jose Luis, terrific. And when Tina, Jose Luis, and Dr. Gilbert speak with us, I'll have them just say a little bit about who they are. Dick, what did you have oh, I know you were raising your thumb. Okay, great. All right, so we're going to do a little bit of history right now, and then we'll start asking our guests some questions. So here we go with history. So highway construction and displacement of minority communities. And I need to adjust my screen a little bit here. Sorry about that. So some historical artifacts. One is that the Federal Housing Administration actually, so one of the aspects I think that is interesting or important to recognize when we're talking about institutionalization of discriminatory practices is that a lot of people think that it wasn't actually codified or it wasn't actually in our laws. And so the research that I've uncovered actually states that many of these concepts were not just general trends within society, but they were actually government policy. So the Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual, which has been developed for a long, long time, in the 1930s, actually recommended the mechanism of highway construction, highway development to separate neighborhoods of color, and in particular Black neighborhoods from white neighborhoods. This is a quote, incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities. So as we hear that type of language dating from almost 100 years ago, what thoughts do you have, or how do you think that impacted Pasadena? You're welcome to add your thoughts in the chat if you'd like, but if not, just think about it. So if freeways were actually designed to divide neighborhoods where, and actually freeway construction or the routes of freeways were selected or picked because they went through certain neighborhoods and not other neighborhoods, how does that make you feel? And then what was the impact on Pasadena? So this is another aerial view. There aren't a lot of photographs that are available of this part of the city. So I was very excited to find this one. So this is the 1970s. And so the historical part is in 1964, the state determined that it was important to connect the 210 or the 710 through Alhambra, South Pasadena, part of LA, and Pasadena, so that the transportation corridor could be what they determined as completed. So I think that's also important to note the timing or the timeline, so that we know this has been 60 years of conversation. So, and some of you on the call are very, very intimate with all this because you were a part of the court case that ended up blocking State Route 710 to come through Pasadena. So thank you for the work that you did. So just to give you some landmarks, on the left side of the freeway stub, there is the Ambassador Auditorium. You can see that taller building. At the very, very top of the photograph is the Parsons building. And so this was also part of eminent domain and taking over some of the neighborhood that had been traditionally Mexican-American, Japanese-American, and African-American. And so also in the top right, you can see Central Park and then part of the Castle Green, just to give you an idea of what it looked like. And this is the kind of the mid 70s this photograph was taken. Actually, usually what I like to do is have someone in the audience read quotes. Is there anyone who would like to read this quote, which I think is pretty significant? And we're talking about Scott United Methodist, First AME Church. Obviously, friendship is on the edge of it. So anybody want to read this quote?
I'll read this.
Thank you.
Will. Okay, well, the first thing to hit me after returning to Pasadena in the early 1970s was physical. I didn't know that you have freeways bisecting the city. Well, of course, you know, I have feelings about that. I know that freeways always follow the path of least resistance, and that would mean through the homes and backyards and the property of poor people. It has to follow the line of least resistance.
Thank you very much. That was excellent, outstanding. So Reverend Wilbur Johnson, who had been in Pasadena, he moved away and then he returned. And I believe he was a part of Scott United Methodist Church. This is, if you haven't seen it yet, this is a part of Exploring Pasadena's Past, which is the 10 West Walnut, and some people call it 100 West Walnut Project, which is an exhibit, which is really, really fascinating. I'd highly recommend all of you to see it. So I feel like visuals are really, really valuable. And as you can see, the shift or the change in the landscape in Pasadena. So 1965, really pretty much not there. There wasn't much of a change. Then we start to see in 1970 a little bit of a shift. And probably a lot of you have seen these photographs previously. But what I'd like to ask you is to think about what happened to the residents who live there, what happened to the churches, what happened to the schools, what happened to the businesses, how were they impacted? And we can see that this dramatic carve out, or the scar that you see on the right in 1974 had a huge impact on those families. I would also say, especially if I think some people in the room would know, where did those families go? Did they stay in Pasadena? Did they have to move other places? What was the compensation like? How did they, how were they moved out of their houses? What was the process by which that happened? There are a lot of important questions about the impact. So what was there before? So we're going to talk about this just for a minute, then I'll bring on Jose Luis and Tina and Dr. Walton. As has been demonstrated in the 10 West Walnut exhibit, this was a thriving neighborhood. So this was not a place where oftentimes government officials will use the term blight. This was not a blighted neighborhood. This was had churches, a Japanese Union church was there. There's Meiji Laundry, and there were other thriving businesses. So I'm going to talk about a couple real quick, just to lay the groundwork to know that this was going on, and that it's a history that is extremely long. So these businesses and residents had been there for decades. So Carrie McAdoo at a grocery store. This is a photograph from front, just to give you sort of a place of a reference. It's down near Huntington Memorial Hospital. So it's kind of on the southeast corner of the 710 freeway stub area. But the neighborhood that included these community members was from about California and Fair Oaks-ish up to Walnut, and from Fair Oaks over to St. John. So this is the interior of the, I always find this photograph interesting, and I'm curious about the child in the photo and where he lived, and then the person in the back who's covering his face. So anyway, Carrie McAdoo ended up being one of the most successful female business owners in Pasadena. Another one that's really important, it's right on the cusp of, and any sort of development is going to be affecting Mejares. It was originally called Jesuitas, which is Jesucitas. Sorry about the pronunciation, Jesucitas. And it was on Fair Oaks, and Jesucita, Mejares fled the Mexican Revolution and opened a small tortilla factory on Fair Oaks, and then eventually created, and it was so popular, there was so many, it was a great business opportunity that a couple of years later, she moved down Palmetto and Pasadena to where it is now. And I know some of you spend a lot of time at Mejares, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. And so that was the edge. And one of the reasons is there were a large number of Mexican Americans who lived in that neighborhood who frequented that site. Another one to mention is the Bellefontaine Nursery and the Uchida family. And this is 1939. Started the Bellefontaine Nursery. It still exists. Mahari still exists. And what's interesting about their story is that they were actually moved because of World War II and to one of the, some people call them concentration camps, prison camps, internment camps. So they were moved to Gila River internment camp in Arizona. The positive aspect of their situation is that when they came back, some of the neighbors from that neighborhood had protected their land. And so they were able to come back and restart the nursery, which is what is still there today. You can go and buy plants from the descendants of the Uchidas. So this is a great photograph of from the 50s in their nursery. So I always like to talk about maps are wonderful because they help to define what we're talking about as far as location. So another aspect I'm not going to go into today, which I talked about last time I was with the village, is the notion of redlining. So redlining was extremely commonplace, or it was a reality in Pasadena, which is, I think, another important fact to mention, is that some people feel like, oh, well, redlining was in other cities, it wasn't in Pasadena, or we're more progressive, and I can show, I didn't put it in today, but I could show anybody the map that actually has the red lines on it if they want to see it. But this was the Planning Commission, and we have several planning commissioners with us today. So this is something the Planning Commission did in 1935, was to identify where families live. So each one of these dots, just as a marker, represents 10 individual African-American individuals. And so we see the concentration of the dots. The yellow horizontal line is Colorado Boulevard. The yellow horizontal then vertical line is Orange Grove Boulevard. And then the two blue lines are the train lines that occur, or that so one is the trolley, that blue line that went up into Altadena, and then the other one is the Southern Pacific. Anyway, the freeway stub is where all those dots are, in the very kind of middle, right below Colorado Boulevard. So we can see the concentration of families. And the reason is because that was downgraded in the housing, let's see, it's the mechanism by which they judge a neighborhood to qualify for loans. It was downgraded, so that was a place where people of color could live because it was rated 4 on the scale from 1 to 4. So it was one of the red zones. So let's talk about a couple of other stories, and then we'll start our conversation. So James Woods came to Pasadena from Texas. He's working shining shoes on Holly Street. He was approached by a local mortician from Reynolds and Everly and asked if he wanted to work in the mortuary business. He thought it was an opportunity and a kind of a light bulb moment, and he said, hey, you know what? This could be a great career for me. He went to LA School of Anatomy, Embalming, and Sanitation, where he earned a certificate of completion in morticians, technology and techniques. And so then he opened up the James Woods Mortuary, which was on Vernon Avenue. So Vernon Avenue is right in the middle of the 710 freeway. Right now it's at if you stand on the Green Street Bridge or the Walnut Street Bridge and you look down in the middle of the freeway, that's where Vernon Avenue was. And so his site was demolished by the mortuary, And in the early 60s, they ended up moving up to North Fair Oak. So this is what the building looks like now. It's serving the community for 95 years and is still going strong. But they were forced to completely change their location service model and create a new structure for the building. Another one I wanted to mention is First AME Church. It was also on Vernon Avenue, and there was a street called Kensington Place. So this is this photograph is taken about 1958. So this is just a few years before the state mandated that the church or that area would be part of the freeway. One part to notice or to note when we're talking about equity is that First AME Church was not, so there was conflict. So this was 1887 is when the church was originally organized, and 1910 was when it moved to this particular site. There was opposition from some in the white community to the presence of the church. And so during its construction, there were several there was an arson attempt to destroy the building. And then, of course, Vernon Avenue was destroyed by the freeway. So before we go into this next phase, what I would like to do is I'd like to invite Jose Luis. Could you come off mute and talk a little bit about your experience and your family's experience? What was it? What was the neighborhood like, or what is your?
Sure. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. We came here. I was an immigrant from Mexico and came here and luckily to Pasadena in 1964. I was 4 years old, and we first moved and lived on Waverly Drive, and then we moved over to a street called Orange Place. And we would walk to school when we were kids, and the school was Garfield, which is no longer there. It used to be right across the street from the hospital. And then the community was, like you said, it was a very vibrant community. A lot of the immigrants that lived in the area were Hispanic and Asian, like you said, African American. And what was good about our community was that there was a lot of work nearby. Almost everyone could walk to work. Where the building at Parsons was a company called La Beda that employed a lot of the ladies that worked in the area, that lived in the area. There was a lot of work that you could walk to. So that was a big part of what kept a lot of Latinos in the community, because we didn't have a car, so we would have to walk everywhere. And I would pass by Harris's every day. I used to know Josecita, the original owner. She was a very sweet lady, and it was just like you said, it was a vibrant community, a lot of people working and enjoying life. And then when we were displaced, we were lucky enough that my mom and dad were able to buy a house in Pasadena still on Molina Avenue, where she still lives today. But a lot of my friends, they lost their homes, and a lot of us were really renters. We didn't own homes, so the homes that we rented, they're the ones that got demolished, and they had to move out of the area. A lot of them moved to Riverside, that area, and then some moved to Palmdale. But we had a name because I came from a country called Mérida, Yucatan, and there was a very vibrant Yucatecan community in the area. Because just like any place else, you come and then, well, I'll bring my cousin, I'll bring my friend, I'll bring so there was a huge community of Yucatecos at one time. And now there's not many of us left. But I have great memories of growing up in Pasadena, and I loved going by Harris's every day and saying hi to Josecita, who was very, very instrumental in helping the Latino community as a whole. So it was very sad when we lost a lot of our friends through the 710 and through the 210. And we still try to keep in touch with some of them that live far away. But in general, it was a very, very, like you said, Brian, a very vibrant community. It was not blithe. It was parties, quinceañeras. At that time, we would have piñatas at the park, and at that time, piñatas weren't as well received as it is now because it was, it was never seen before. And so it was, in general, it was just a great community, and I enjoyed it. And it was sad to see a lot of people leave the community, but like I say, it was a great community, and I would love to be having the 710 hub help low income housing, something like that, because I do think that we need to bring those people back, or whoever wants to live in that area. But it was a great community.
Jose Luis, we'll talk a bit about solutions in a minute. Do you recall, or have you talked to anybody about that dislocation or the relocation? So a couple of specific questions. Do you have any idea how much people were offered to move, and then how easy or how smooth was that process?
Well, actually, most of my friends, we didn't really own a home. We didn't really know a lot of people that own homes. Like I say, most of the people that I knew were renters. So we were not.
Were renters offered any sort of compensation?
No, we were not offered anything except like you got, 30 days or 60 days to leave. And there really wasn't much compensation at all. And the people that own the homes, I'm sure they were compensated. I don't know how, because they were owners of the building. And a lot of the homes back then were larger homes, and the owners would split them out and to make like a home that was huge. They'd split them up and into parts. So it'd be like, used to be a 6-bedroom home. They would split it and make one a 2-bedroom and the other a 2-bedroom rental, and upstairs a rental. You understand what I'm saying? They would be a huge home, but they split it to get more rent out of the immigrants.
Yeah, and just to give a comparison, were those homes then, did they kind of look like the ones on, say, Marengo or Garfield above the freeway?
Yes, they're that type of homes, large, beautiful, beautiful homes. Yeah, they were, exactly.
Yeah, and so maybe one other question, and then I'll ask Tina to weigh in too, is what do you think? So I think when we talked one time, you talked about your mom and the fact that she knew a lot of the neighbors.
Yes.
And what happened to those kind of networks, or what happened to those relationships? And what was your mom's kind of role in the neighborhood?
Oh, my mom, she was, like I say, like she had never, when we lived in Mexico, she never really worked until she came to this country. Then she had to work. She made very good, deep, long-lasting friendships with people. And she's sometimes still friends with a lot of them. But she was lucky enough to know how to make cakes, and she would make cakes and sell them out of the house also. So then luckily she was able to open a business in Pasadena on Lake Street, across the street from Food for Less, for over 30 years, making cakes. So they always called her the cake lady. And so she still has a lot of people that she knew back then. But like I said, a lot of them did move out of the area. So she lost a lot of contact with a lot of very good people. Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's Jose Luis, we'll circle back to you in a minute.
Sure.
But let's Tina and Dr. Walton, I was just wondering from your perspective, what are you aware of that was in that neighborhood, and how was it affected by the freeway?
Sure. Thank you, Brian. Dr. Walton, you okay if I go first? He has wonderful stories as well. My name is Tina Williams, and yeah, I'm a native Pasadenan. So born and raised in Pasadena. I remember my earliest memory was at First AMU Church. I was actually baptized there as an infant and went there as a child before it moved to its present location. So, but my memories are very vague because I wasn't that old at the time. But I do know of just the displacement that has happened was community based. I mean, can you imagine growing up in a neighborhood where you had your local school, your worship, place of worship, and you know, it wasn't a food desert because there were stores, and then all of that's taken from you. So while I wasn't directly, my family wasn't directly displaced, I do know the implications of it as I said, being a native Pasadenian.
Great, thank you. Dr. Walton, what would you add?
Well, I am not a native Pasadenan. I came here in 1888 and moved into central Pasadena. My church moved ultimately, that started out on North Lake, moved to North Fair Oaks, 1787 North Fair Oaks. And so my experience with this, though, I can have a tremendous amount of compassion for the displacement, because this is something that happened across the country, certainly not just in Pasadena. But I had a wonderful neighborhood, I think the best neighborhood I've ever grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, which had a similar kind of situation. That at the age of 16, I was displaced by a freeway. And it really affected me greatly, but in a perverse way, perhaps not as bad as the people who were displaced from the 710 and the 210, et cetera. And part of the reason for that is that we were segregated. And so we were pretty much confined to continuing in the same schools. I continued in the same church. But what did happen, there was a fracture in the relationships, especially in those like my parents, people who were older. I was the youngest child. So as a result, I still continued to visit that old neighborhood, and we were able to find a house in the same city. So I maintained those relationships and friendships physically by visiting that neighborhood for 36 years. And even now to this day, I still am in phone contact and message with friends that I met back at that time when I was a child. So those relationships were very important to me, and to have that broken, especially if you had to change your school and your church, and to end those relationships where people had worked together in a community in a very collaborative way, you could see how traumatizing it would be.
Thank you, Dr. Walton. That's very, very helpful to provide that context and to know this is a national issue. And I think sometimes as Pasadenans, we say, you know, we're kind of a microcosm of the rest of the country, for better or worse, because we have, it's a relatively small town or small city, but we have all of the issues of a large city. And this is one of those, an example of one of those. Tina, I know you've worked in the community a long time. I was just wondering from your perspective, as far as kind of the exodus from old Pasadena up to Northwest Pasadena for a lot of families, is there anything you observed, especially during your time working for an elected official, about the impacts of that that displacement?
I think the community distrust is one factor. When I worked for former council member Jackie Robinson of District 1, we initiated the Lincoln Avenue specific plan. That was her, she initiated that. And I oversaw that process, focus groups, and, you know, the consultant that was hired. It was a very lengthy process that took 5 years. I do remember community. And so my job as a field representative, what we were called then, council liaison today, was to be out in the community, the listening ear, and to interact with community on a lot of different subject areas. And surrounding the specific plan, I distinctly remember a gentleman coming up to me, and he handed me a plan, and he said, this has been tried before. And it was in 1980, around 1980, there was a plan to enhance Lincoln Avenue. He said, it has no teeth, you need a specific plan. So I took that information back to Council Member Robinson. And she requested a specific plan. So community has always had an ear to the ground, knows the history, knows what's happened before. And I use this as an example because in the focus groups, one of the things that bubbled up were people were saying, you know, you're going to improve this neighborhood, and when it's improved, they're going to move us out. And I assured community members that wasn't the intent, nor did we have that desire. But what I'm seeing is that happen, and it's happened before. Improvements are made, and then folks of color are pushed out. So the displacement, in particular with the freeway, has that same consequence of moving communities that are designated by people in power as expendable out of the city intentionally. And so there's a historic precedent for why people feel this way. It isn't just some unease with no validity. There is validity in the way that they felt, because historically those kinds of things have happened. So if the city wants to restore trust, I think they have to start with the historic perspective that you're giving today and understand the implications that have happened generationally and how we can start to build transparency and trust again in the neighborhood.
And that's a great pathway to kind of the next phase of our conversation. And I just want to raise up a couple of the comments in the chat. One is intent versus impact is an important consideration. So thank you for recognizing that, Joshua. And then it will be important, Juliana mentions Delgado, that how many tenants and business owners and how many were property owners and who were compensated. So we'll talk a little bit about what the city is planning with the working group, the 710 working group stub, and they should be, or maybe an outcome from this conversation would be for some of you to be able to pass the answers to those questions onto the 710 working stub, so that then they would have a more informed decision-making process. What I would like to do before I'm going to show you just a couple more slides. Before we do that, I thought I read in the chat that there was one other person at least who had lived experience in the 710 freeway stub. Is that correct? Is there anyone else who actually lived there like Jose Luis? And if that's not what I read, then that's fine too. We can move on. And then we just had, Sandy McConnell. Okay, we just had a comment about Native American tribes as well. So I think that's important to uplift also. So with your organizations or as individuals, be sure to include a Native American perspective also when we're talking about people who lived on this land previously. So thank you, whoever added that. So just a couple more comments about, or we will just do a quick update so that we're all on the same page. So the state law and the 710 working group, the 710 stub working group. So this is when, you know, we saw that aerial photograph right at the very beginning of the Colorado Street Bridge and the 134 Freeway Bridge. This was actually started a long time before that. So this is 1953, and you can see the what's known now as the 9th District Court of Appeals, and was at one time a hotel and a hospital. So our city has gone through dramatic developmental changes over the years, significant ones. So one of the reasons why I'm showing this is to say that with the 710 freeway stub, another sort of dramatic improvement to the city could be made for all of the reasons that Tina talked about, and Dr. Walton as well, and Jose Luis. So just some key facts. just to kind of bring it to a close, you know, there was 60 years nearly of battle, I guess you would say. And again, there are people on this call who were very instrumental in that process. The culmination of it was in October of 2019, the governor signed 2 pieces of legislation that eliminated the freeway itself. And then there was a long conversation, well, not as long, but a conversation about a tunnel option. So that was to dig down underneath the area where Pasadena Avenue is, and burrow all the way down to through South Pasadena to Alhambra. So those were ended. The legislation opens up the door for the city of Pasadena to redevelop the stub end of the highway. And again, Juliana and Carol can correct me, but I'm calling it redevelop as opposed to develop. So some of the options include housing, commercial, retail, restaurant space, modes of transportation. I think for groups like this, what you need to be thinking about are what are the priorities for equity, justice, and fairness that need to be utilized to decide how that area is developed. Again, it's 40 acres. So the starting point for this is the 710 Freeway Stub Working Group. Interestingly, if any of you want to apply for it, they've extended the application deadline to the end of the day today. So you are still welcome. I believe it would be 5 o'clock to apply if you feel as though it's important. I won't go into the details about how the formation of it or the components of it, but there are some that are selected by the city council members, some by the mayor, and then there are some who will be chosen because they have lived experience. So Jose Luis, as an example, has lived experience with the area, and so that will be a priority. So just a callback to the 10 West Walnut cultural exhibit. Building freeways, dividing communities is a very important sign. So we do have an exhibit. We are cognizant of the impact that these freeways have caused. So how might we improve the lives of these families through this process? So it commemorates the stories of African-American, Mexican-American, and Japanese-American families who lived in the neighborhood. And there was a question in the chat about the amount that if you were a homeowner, how much did you receive? So that'll be interesting for all of us to conduct research. I have some statistics. I don't necessarily want to share them because I haven't verified them. So I want to open it up to a little bit larger conversation. I want to start with Dr. Walton, Tina, and Jose Luis first. But I'm going to take this screen share off. So if you want to kind of jot down these questions, and actually we'll start with another chat exercise. But what is a priority for you? What do you want to see in this area? What is important that we don't forget in this area? And don't put it in the chat yet, but we want to raise some of those up. So recognize the examples of inequity, discrimination that are occurring today and in history, and then be thinking about everything from homeownership, family wealth, voting rights, public education, etc. And then what I mentioned earlier is what is the criteria? What is the lens that the working group and then ultimately city council is going to use to make those decisions? And what is our role in helping them to include equity, to include civil rights, to include social justice in everything that they're talking about? And then this issue has come up a lot over time is reparations. And I think there's a misunderstanding about what reparations are and how they would be manifested. But what are your thoughts about reparations for families who live there? And what would that look like? What would be a fair way of trying to repair the damage that was caused? And what would be achievable as well? What would be acceptable? And everyone should be thinking about, since you're on this call, This is probably going to be a 10-year long project, at least 5 to 10 years. What is your role in this project? And then what will you use from this presentation to help you to be a participant? And what are you going to tell your networks of family and friends? So I'm going to take off the screen share now for pretty much the rest of our conversation. So I'd like you to, in the chat, put what is a priority for you for this area? What do you want to see? And then we're gonna talk about it. Again, we'll start with Jose Luis, Tina, and Dr. Walton, and then we want to hear from other people in the community, other people on this call as well. So, but just let's start it off by what needs to be in this place, this special place for Pasadena, especially because it's going to be transformed back to being part of the community in a more human-centered or in a more culturally centered aspect instead of just being a freeway for transportation. So on the count of 3, start dropping things in the chat. What do you want to see there? 1, 2, 3, go. And we'll just read through some of these as well. Affordable housing, and especially a priority for the descendants. That's awesome. That's great. Low-cost housing, community garden, a museum. And this is an important one. The museum or a plaque to honor the history. And that's what has been done to for the 10 West. So it would be an expansion. Yeah, and this is an important question. And it's something, and maybe Giuliani, you'll have a chance to talk about it in a few minutes, because we still have time left for everyone. Do we fill it in, or do we? Is it? I want everybody to think about this, because this is kind of interesting. I didn't even think about it until I talked to Giuliana's students, but it's kind of a U shape now. Could it just be left like that and then redeveloped that way, or would you have to bring in dirt to fill it in? If you have to bring in dirt to fill it in, where does that dirt come from? How does it get here? All those sorts of questions. So could it just be another sort of a valley or an arroyo in the city? That's great. A park. What else? Underground spaces, housing. Venues for social integration. This is a terrific suggestion. Thank you for putting that in there. In our modern society, a lot of times we're pushed away from each other. There aren't spaces that encourage us to talk to one another. So that Jose Luis's story is about, his mother being kind of the vortex of the neighborhood, and neighborhood families would come over there and talk to her, and then they'd bake and those sorts of things. That we need those sorts of spaces to create more intimacy and more deeper relationships. Public marketplace, and this is good to have. So for Marcus, to have comparisons or analogies that we can look at. And utilizing. This is a good question, and that's a different conversation. But the question is, how about the homes that are taken by eminent domain that still exist? There's a whole process for that. We can talk about that a little bit later. Another library, cultural center, small business, small manufacturing. These are fantastic. Thank you all. So let's start with Jose Luis. Can you go back into a little bit more detail? Especially having lived there,
Yeah.
what would you like to see there in your heart of hearts, in a kind of a dream? And by the way, Dick and the Pasadena, before you start, Jose Luis, Dick and the Pasadena Village, please, by all means, can you capture the chat before we shut this down? I know it's being recorded, but can you save the chat so that we have this whole list for us to look at? So Jose Luis, go ahead.
Yeah, I love a lot of these ideas, but I think the affordable housing incorporated into a plan and a break from our business owners, that's fantastic. And also people of the families displaced that would love to come back. There was some people would love to come back to Pasadena, but they can't afford it. So maybe making like that for people that were displaced, maybe they get first dibs on trying to be able to come back in. But I would love low house housing to be there. That's my number one priority that I love. And I do like the also the memorial and things like that. That'd be part of it. It'd be part of the neighborhood, like plaques like the one that you said is by the 10. I've seen that. It's a great thing, but a lot of people don't even know that's there and don't even go get a chance to see it. So I would love something like that. That of all my heart's heart is low cost housing is the one that I love the best.
Great, thank you. Tina, what are you thinking?
You're muted.
And go ahead and come off mute when you're ready.
Sorry, I just want to inform your audience what our task force is about, and that will inform them as to, is that coming later or sometime?
No, go ahead and do that. But think about language. So we have the 710 Freeway stub working group,
Mhm.
and try to define for us how your group is different
Okay.
from that. Okay.
Sure. Yeah. Restorative Justice Pasadena is the task force I belong to, 710 Restorative Justice Pasadena. I'm just going to read what we are about. We're comprised of local nonprofit organization and leaders and community members advocating for a just and equitable solution in the 710 stub redevelopment plan. Our mission is to collaborate in creating a repair-based solution that is historically rooted, community-led, and ensures those who were displaced or directly impacted participate in and benefit from the solution. Now, how that may be different from the working group, it could be the same depending on how the working group is constructed. It's 13 members and we've applied to be on the working group. Dr. Walton, myself, and Jasmine Schuper. We're hoping to have an influence on the direction because this working group, we all know this is historic. This is something a once in a lifetime opportunity for the city of Pasadena. This development or whatever plans come out of the land use is historic. And so the weight of that is something we know we have to think about. And so we've been listening first and foremost. The people that were displaced, and I'm so grateful, Brian, that you've had Jose here who could talk about that from his perspective. And we've been listening to those folks who have been displaced. That's our first intent, because we're not suggesting that we have all the answers. We want to hear from the people who were impacted. But we also understand generational wealth was taken from those folks. You have discrepancies in a home. And I would correct, it was a Reverend Johnson's statement that the path of least resistance to the poor, because that is, I don't think that's fully accurate. There were Black professionals living in the area as well as working class people. And so there was a mix of incomes that were affected by this. Now, the least resistance, the path of least resistance could be said to be people of color and especially African Americans. So I think that is a little bit nuance of that, what was stated by him. So I think what we're intending to do is look at who was impacted and make sure that representation takes that into account in decision making, as well as gaining, there were Black businesses there. There was affordable housing is great, but that's not necessarily geared towards building wealth, generational wealth that was taken from these families. If they had still lived there, what would their income be now? What would their children's income be? What opportunities would have existed for their families living there had they not been displaced? So I'll leave that for Dr. Walton to tag on to what I've said. Thank you.
Great. And Dr. Walton, could
Yes.
you pause just for a second? We've just been joined by Danny Parker. Danny, do you have a couple of minutes, or do you need to, or how long can you stay?
I can stay for 20 minutes or so. So again,
Okay.
thanks for accommodating me.
let's-
Apologize for the disruption. So just wherever it fits, and you can tee up so I'm not being too repetitious with what's been discussed for whenever the moment is appropriate.
Great. So thank you for being here. So Dr. Walton, let's go back to you, and then we'll bring Danny in a minute.
Okay, I'm going to,
And just to clarify that that what Tina is talking about is a separate, it's a community-led group that is separate from the city, that is trying to achieve all the goals that she talked about. So Dr. Walton, please expand.
Yeah, I would like to second a lot of what Tina said with respect to the fact that we're on the same group. And what she read to you was our mission statement. I don't want to be too specific about what I would want, not having talked to descendants of people who live there, people in the community who I think should have some input. But from my point of view, I think certainly the people who live there should have a high priority in terms of an on-ramp to live there at some level. And I think that affordable housing is great, but I also think that a mixture of housing would be appropriate. Some of it market rate, some of it workforce, some of it affordable. I think opportunities for business and yes, even manufacturing, as long as that is environmentally friendly. One of the things that has happened to communities of color is that industry has often been brought in, and that has subjected people to some really adverse impact from just business industry itself. And I think that light industry was a part of this community before. Green space, yes, a museum that recognizes what has happened there on that site, even going back and including some of the indigenous people who had lived there as they, all of that should be included. But in terms of what it finally should look like, there should be an opportunity for people who lost wealth to regain that wealth, that position, because that's one of the things that has happened historically, is that when people have been forced into segregated communities, they have lost wealth, they've been not allowed to buy homes in many cases. And I think that that's a tremendous marker for racial discrimination, is the wealth gap between whites and African Americans, people of color in general. So that's what I would like to see on this site, a diverse community, similar to the diversity of what was there before, different income groups, et cetera. I think that sort of cross-feeding is important. And I'll just add very quickly, for me personally, to move out of a ghetto into that community that I mentioned to you, Ellsbury Community Park, which was taken by the Freeway, it was a launch pad for me so that I could change my sights about what it was that I wanted to be, what I could become, what I could do. And that led to my family all getting college educated, all of us, 5 children. And so I think it's very important to create that kind of community and opportunity for people today.
I just want to add, I'm sorry, Brian, before we move on, the distinction you asked us, me to distinguish ourselves from the working group that the city has assigned, that 13-member working group. And our group went before council, Jasmine Schuper and myself, and we asked council because initially the mayor was going to have 4 seats. So each council member gets to choose one person, doesn't have to be in their district, to sit on this committee. The mayor at one point was going to have 4, now 2 seats. And then there are 2 people who are seats for those persons whose families were displaced. They're descendants of, or they may be an actual displaced person. And the other 2 seats go to at large. So it's comprised of 13, but we were saying when we went to council, initially it was 4 seats. There was no provision for any of the membership to be people who were displaced. And we said, if you're going to have additional seats, there should be people at the table, a voice for, a seat for. We asked for 3, we got 2 people who are direct descendants of those who were displaced. And they said yes to that. And we were grateful for that. So that is our role at this point. We were trying to help council just implement that as a part of it, as well as we said, when this rolls out, there needs to be a historical piece that rolls out with it. Just as you're informing this group today, our 710 Restorative Justice Pasadena is saying the city as a whole, community members as a whole need to understand the history. So this needs to be talked about in community meetings, district-wide, in our library systems. It needs to be talked about, so people can make informed decisions about and learn the history of Pasadena and what happened to people. So that was the other provision that we asked for, and that we asked whoever is chosen as a historian needs to work with local historians as well, such as yourself, Brian, and Danny, and others who really know and are steeped in the history. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for that clarification. That's terrific. And yes, one of the questions in the chat, which I want Tina and Dr. Walton to pay attention to, is you've had some people who are interested in joining your group. So before we end today, make sure that you either send them a private chat, or actually it would be better if to everyone you sent your contact information, so that if they're interested, they can join your group. So Danny, thank you for joining us. We're coming toward the end of our conversation. So briefly think about two things. What is your experience with this area? Or what do you know about this area briefly? But then if you could focus more on what you think should happen there. That's what we're working on now, are some solutions or the next phase for the 710 stub. So thank you for joining us.
So my knowledge comes from going to First AME Church until 1967, when it was located at Kensington and Vernon, which is approximately 1 block west of Parsons. So the northern end of the stub. And then from 1964 to 68, I went to Sequoia School, which is at the southern end of it, where the 710 stub ends. And my recollection of the area, briefly, as relevant as this may be, is Vernon, which ran right down the middle of the freeway, was mostly single-family homes, modest but generally well kept. And Pasadena Avenue was more of a mixed-use proposition. There were restaurants and other non or commercial uses interspersed with housing. Then when you got to Colorado, there were things like Jack Walsh Chevrolet, then First AME Church in the next block, and some small businesses like Shimoda Lawnmower and some others in there. And I think the other thing, if I can go a little bit broader, Brian, as I always tend to do, I think it's important to look at not just exactly what the freeway displaced, but the ripple effect in surrounding neighborhoods and the impact. Because of that, the efforts that led to the removal of the housing on DeLacy, for example, where now there's those relatively recently built apartments and condos between Del Mar and Green. Those were where a lot of people lived as well. And that was part of the city of Pasadena's overall broader scheme that included the Pepper Street redevelopment project, now known as Kings Villages, Parsons, and the expansion of Ambassador College. So the freeway was a part of a larger scheme. And the impact, I think, as we're looking at solutions, I think we have to be a bit more broad-minded. I would say, with respect to what Dr. Walton said, I think a mixed use set of uses does make sense. I think being environmentally sensitive is part of the equation. Trying to have the aesthetic blend with the surrounding neighborhoods is important. But I think the most important guiding principle, or one of the most important to me, is this is very valuable land, obviously, a built out city, 40 to 65 acres right in the heart of the city. And it's a major economic opportunity. And it's not just a matter of something that might be seen as sort of restitution related for those descendants or the descendants or the people who are directly displaced. But there is a major economic opportunity, and there should be a seat at the table for those displaced individuals to have an opportunity to participate in this economic windfall that will be forthcoming. So I'm hoping that's a very broad scope, but I'm hoping that will be the reality that is realized.
Wonderful. That was very, very helpful, Danny. Thank you. And what I'd like to do, we have maybe 10 minutes left. What I'd like to do is have more of an open conversation for a few minutes. And if there is anyone, oh, Danny, you want to add one more?
Can I cite two quick statistics that you've heard me cite before that I think gives a bigger picture for what was happening? So in the late 1950s, in the 1957-58 school year, there were 4 public schools in the Pasadena Unified School District that had a majority of Black students. They were Cleveland, Washington, Lincoln and Garfield. Two of those schools were torn down in the early 70s because of declining enrollment because the freeways took much of their attendance areas. So for those not familiar, Lincoln Elementary School is the site of now the main post office, and Garfield Elementary School is immediately north of the Huntington Hospital. And it's now that Vaughn's Anchored Shopping Center. I don't know why I'm blurry in the Zoom, and I apologize for how distracting that may be. The other statistic that I think, again, puts in perspective what the city of Pasadena was up to in the late 1950s is the four largest Black churches in Pasadena were First AME, Friendship, Scott United Methodist, and Metropolitan Baptist Church. Of those four, First AME and Metropolitan Baptist Church were directly in the freeway path and had to move, and Scott United Methodist is where Parsons was located. The only church that didn't have to move was Friendship. And so again, I think that highlights in stark terms some of what was going on by the city fathers in their planning and ethnic relocation, I guess I'll somewhat politely put. Anyway, I think that's a data point that is illuminating.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for including the schools and how the schools and the churches were impacted as well. So we have a few minutes left. What I'd like to do is offer the opportunity for, and I know, like I said, there are several people who've worked on this project for many, many years, or have worked on this issue, maybe not project, but issue for many years. Would you like to expand on what you placed in the chat as far as ideas, solutions, suggestions, and focus your comments on I would say productive outcomes. If you do, please raise your hand and I'll call on you. If you don't, between Danny and me, we can talk a lot about these issues. So I'm sure we can fill up the time. Is there anyone who would like to offer an explanation for why you think what you placed in the chat is important and valuable for and see, okay, let's start with Marcus and then Jose Luis. I saw you raise your hand as well. We can swing back to you in a minute. Marcus, go ahead.
Yeah, I just I put a note in there about a public marketplace like Reading Terminal Market in Philadelphia or Eastern Market in Detroit, and these places are places not only of social integration and gathering of you know, all types of folks. There's actually sociologists who have written about Reading Terminal as kind of a cosmopolitan canopy where you just have this generation where everybody from the city can interact, and it feels like a good, safe space for people to interact. But it also provides an opportunity to generate some of that wealth. That Reading Terminal is operated by a nonprofit, and they have in their bylaws that only locally owned businesses get a stall or get a space. It's primarily food-based, but there can be other craft businesses, but it's local people occupy that space. So you don't have chains or businesses kind of moving in, and it provides a stepping stone for places to graduate from maybe a stall at one of the public markets to operating their own businesses. So it also becomes a ladder in that way.
Excellent. Thank you, Marcus. And that hits on several issues or topics that we've discussed today. And one is economic contributions, and then opportunities for people to mix and mingle and form relationships. Jose Luis, I saw you had your hand up. Was there something else that you?
Yeah, no, I have a question. Like when all this is great, I did apply to be part of the working group, so hopefully I'll get picked. But I did that yesterday. Who has the final decision on what's going to happen? After all this is going on, the working group and everything, who's the last person to say this is going to happen?
Well, my understanding, and I could ask either Bill Bogard, Carol Hernandez, or Juliana Delgado to answer this question, or even Claire Bogard, but my understanding is it's city council essentially determines the zoning and the plan for the area, and then it's depending on how each parcel is developed, then there is a design process for an independent architect and development firm to come up with a plan for a particular area. But do any one of the four of you want to answer that question? Who's the final arbiter on this? Carol, are you talking? Go ahead and unmute.
It would go to the planning commission, and then it would go to the city council. It would be a specific plan, which would go through a very lengthy review process through the community. So it'll be a long time coming. You're first going to have to decide how you're going to fill it in before you ever get to decisions as to how it's going to be developed. It's a long process, but the council is going to be the final decision maker.
Thank you, Carol. Juliana.
I'm muted. Yeah, Carol got it right. It's going to be, it's a public process. It goes through, public participation, due diligence, and eventually it'll go to the planning commission and then and perhaps other commissions, depending on the council's will. And then the council will enact it and it'll become the law. It'll be zoning. But before we get to that point, there are major questions that have to be decided. One of them being, do you fill in the ditch, or do you put stories in there? Do you have 3 underground stories that could be utilized as space? Do you terrace the property so you have more building footprint? And then there's other giant questions over and above the questions about equity and diversity, which are huge questions to resolve. How we're going to make this fair, and how are folks going to be, what kind of reparation we're going to have for people who's had their lives just completely upended. But there's questions like infrastructure. There's going to have to be a plan to put in all the water and the sewer and the streets, and it's going to have to come after we actually decide what this is going to look like physically. And then again, the other big question is, you have 2 sides of the the 2 adjacent sides to this property. You have Old Pasadena, which is dense with mixed use on one side, and then you have lower scale residential on the other side. What's going to happen to make that work? So there are a lot of giant questions, and this is going to take a long time, and I hope it does. And I hope everybody participates and watches this, because this is an unprecedented opportunity for Pasadena. This doesn't happen in urbanized areas very often. So we should celebrate that part and work to make it work on all levels.
Thank you so much, Juliana, for that overview. And this is either a city planner's nightmare or a city planner's dream come true. Because
it's a dream.
Yeah, it's a dream, because it's very rare that you have a blank slate like this. But that's why it's so complex, because it is shall we say, it's not concrete, although it is concrete that would be removed, but it's not. How we're going to use it is still up in the air. And that's why, and maybe we can close with this, that's why it's so important for citizen voice, for community voice to be heard and to be a part of the conversation, whether that's through Tina's group, the 710 Restorative Justice Task Force, or you as individuals, or a nonprofit you might be a part of, that there are going to be many opportunities for you to weigh in. And the starting point is with the 710 working group, with those individuals so again, today is the final deadline. If any of you want to spend the next 10 years of your life deciding what's going to go on here, apply for it, submit your application. And that is the first starting point, is to start to talk to those people and do what I heard earlier. teach them, if they don't know, teach them about the history, teach them about some of the societal impacts, and share your ideas with them. For example, Marcus's idea of that marketplace, I mean, those are dynamic spaces. Seattle has that, San Francisco has that. So it's being a part of change. And that's the wonderful opportunity that we all have to participate in. So I want to thank the Pasadena Village and Dick Myers in particular for inviting me and Tina and Jose Luis and Danny and Dr. Walton to be here today. And we hope, and actually maybe one last request for the chat is if you could place in the chat right now, was this a valuable experience? And if so, what will you take away with you? What's something you will take with you today? Put that in the chat right now while Dick is taking us out. And thanks to the Pasadena Village team. I see you on the video there, and learn more about the working group, what they're going to do, learn about the process that's going to City Council, and be a part of it. So thank you, Dick, and this was a wonderful experience.
Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you all the panelists. I can't go through all the names, but we appreciate everyone's contribution, and we appreciate everyone's participation. The recording will be placed up on our website within a few days, probably midweek next week, and it'll be available, and we'll have a write-up on our blog. So if you go to the blog post, you can catch up on that there, and there will be a link from there to where you can get the recording. So we look forward to seeing you in future presentations. We'll have more of these things coming up. Brian and I are working on doing some more follow-ups along this same theme. And we have a number of other interesting conversations coming up. So keep your eyes on the blog and try to stay informed. And we hope to see everyone again in the future. Thank you very much for coming. We appreciate it.
And Dick, please save the chat. Have someone at the village.
Absolutely. Yes,
save the chat.
I'll definitely save it. So I've been saving it along as we go. So we'll have it available. So thank you everyone for coming, and I'll stop the recording as soon as I can find the button. Thanks very much. Thanks very much. We appreciate it, everyone.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jose Luis. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Dr. Walton. Thank you, Danny.